What was that? Trade routes, and especially like the demand for goods, right? If you would face, for instance, if we lived in a world with the collapse of modern China, let's say China basically went from being what it is now and a global factory to hardly existing at all. What happens in the rest of the world? You have chaos because people aren't prepared to produce all the stuff that's made in China. And the factories and the know-how and the all kinds of those things. So if you're living in Israel at this time, at the collapse of the Bronze Age, and the major world powers suddenly fall like houses of cards, that's a time of tremendous upheaval. The little trade that you were probably doing before and the merchants, they probably lose all their money because now not only do you have the interruption of trade routes and things become a lot less secure, and so bandits on the highways, if you can call them highways, along the dirt roads and the meandering things through the wilderness, banditry becomes more of a problem because people are desperate and they're starving, so they resort to attacking caravans, which means that trade is shutting down, which means that people are unemployed and they don't have money, and you have widespread failure of crops. You see how it's a bit of a recipe for disaster? Like, you take all of these things and it's like, all you need is the moment that lights the match and throws it into the gas can, and the whole thing explodes. And if you're a society like Israel, and you're living in a world where everything around you just blew up, no one's really prepared for that situation. You don't really know what to do. Now, if you have interior strength and cohesion, you could grow and adapt because there's now a power vacuum that demands to be filled. But the Israelites don't have that yet. They don't have a kingship. They don't have a kingdom. And so when we talk about the time of the judges as being a bit of a dark age, you see how it is the bringing together of all these different strands of history. And it's like, oh yeah, it makes sense. Like the entire world just blew up around them. And so the fact that they're in the midst of turmoil fits. For some time, the world descends into great chaos. This is one of the dark ages of the ancient world that not a lot is produced from. So that's the collapse of the Bronze Age and the transition to the Iron Age. And it's marked by a dramatic societal change, dramatic societal upheaval. What that means exactly is hard to say. But the people of Israel do continue to survive. They are still there. There's just not a lot of them. And in the aftermath, in that power vacuum, new empires rise, like the Assyrians in northern Iraq. They will come to dominate the entire Levant, the entire Fertile Crescent, which stretches down to the Persian Gulf and then across into Syria and modern-day Israel. So that's the historical background for picking up the story of David. David and his immediate ancestors are going to be living in the midst of a world where everything just fell apart and is only gradually being put back together. And so this sets up, well, what was life like in the ancient Near East? That's the region that Israel is a part of. In the Iron Age, what did they do? Okay, we just blew up society, but what does that mean? So a lot of this is guesses, but it's like I tried to do some research and put some things together, and I hope that this makes sense. So in Iron Age societies, they were extremely stratified. The very, very wealthy were on top, and it was an extremely small number, dramatically smaller than now. So you could think of a series of people, maybe 10 or 20 families, that likely own the majority of the land. They have estates, they have thousands of slaves and servants, they have multiple places, and most of society is involved in that category of being a slave or a servant. Slavery was not racial at this point. Slavery was political. Usually you ended up being a slave if your country lost a war. They would make a bunch of people slaves. Sometimes people were born into it, but slavery was not the same kind of political evil that it's thought of like by people today. It was just an accepted fact of society. In many cases, something like a third of the people were slaves. And being a slave often meant that you were better off than if you were landed poor. If you worked and you weren't a slave, but you had land, some small piece of land, you were often even worse off than the slaves. Slave was a bit more of a social class than a status. Like it operates in a different context, particularly in a different context than it does in the southern United States in the 1800s, in the modern day slave trade that was racial, and it was whites and blacks. Black Africans. It's not like that. All kinds of different groups of people were slaves. Some of them would be foreigners. They probably are looked down upon somewhat in society. But if you remember your Old Testament, the Jewish people were actually one of the kinder groups to slaves because there are prohibitions, there are rules about the treatment of slaves in the Old Testament that lots of societies didn't have. Remember that this is also the age long before the Magna Carta, which happens in the 1200s in England, which, like, the idea of individual rights basically doesn't exist. Corruption is widespread, paramount, absolutely rampant in society. The wealthy families are likely all involved in corruption. The poor are almost always taken advantage of by basically everyone. There's very little chance to get ahead. Society is very stratified. You have institutions that reinforce this kind of stratification, because if you were that wealthy, you could afford to have your children educated. And if they were educated, it would be easier for them to step into these wealthier roles, or these roles that required education. If you were poor, then children had to go to work basically as soon as they could. So there's a ton of social stratification, there's separation, and the top of the pyramid is extremely small. Dramatically smaller than today. One of the things that we don't realize, and I like some of the scholars who pointed out, people like Thomas Sowell and Jordan Peterson, is that we actually live in the wealthiest society that has ever existed on the face of the earth in ways that are so hard to imagine that we've completely lost all perspective on it. At this time, most people don't eat meat as a regular part of their diet. Very often, they're maybe eating enough to survive. Their teeth are being ground to bits because they use millstones that are stone, and as you use a millstone, stone chunks get mixed in with your grain, which wears out your teeth. And so as you got older, your teeth shrunk and would be exposed, and they didn't have people to do root canals, so it was painful. And in lots of cases, it got infected, and there's no antibiotics to save you from infection, and so you would die. I mean, like, we've completely lost all perspective on this. Even in modern day American poor, if you would compare it to life in the Iron Age, they would be among the wealthiest people on the planet for what they have. So it is dramatically different. Most of the people have to work hard in food production. Food production, it's called subsistence living. And when you are a society living at a subsistence level, it means that you basically produce what you need to survive, and there's very little margin, there's very little over that. So any major event like a drought or a war causes you to go from survival to starvation. Life is centered in and around the home and food production. Basically, everyone is involved in it in some way, every member of the family. People seem to live in kind of clan homes or clan areas. They would add on to homes and add extra rooms. The families lived in the same areas even if they didn't share the same house. So you were more or less stuck with your relatives. You didn't move across the country away from them. That they were there. People lived in close contact with animals. In some ways that provides a lot of defenses, and in other ways it means that there's a lot of diseases that you have to wrestle with. Because animals also produce different goods that you need, but they transmit diseases. People often kept smaller herds close to their houses and many times inside of it. It seems like the most common home at this point had 4 rooms and it was surrounded by a wall. You still encounter this if you go to places like Israel and you see the old homes. People have like a wall around their house with a gate in it. That seems to be very historical. They would have one room for some animals. They would have one room that was used for storage. They would have one room that was used for sleeping. This would often be on the roof or built over the top of another room because it's also a warm region, so they don't in general deal with cold and being cold. So it's a much bigger deal to stay cool than to stay warm. Although in that region, when you do have cold snaps, they're dramatic and they're problematic. They could cause major issues. The roof was made out of wooden beams covered with layers of branches and smoothed down clay. So it could provide some support, but it wasn't as strong as the house walls. Homes were often, the outside of them seems to be made out of stone, that you had stone walls. They didn't use wood for very many things because they didn't have a lot of trees. Israel wasn't a wooded land. Lebanon had more wood, but for the most part they were using stone. Floors were likely dirt for many people. If you were wealthy, they might be flagstone, like big flat stones of some kind. They would be very small by our standards today, and they would have way more people in them than we were comfortable with. Families would all sleep together in the same room. This modern thing about having separate rooms was basically unknown. Towns were often small. They were built very often on a hilltop for defense. So you could see people coming, you could see bandits coming, and you would go behind a wall. In this time in Israel, it's not a time where you see the development of major cities. They just don't really come into existence. There are some cities, there are larger cities, but again, by our standards, they would be extremely small. Jerusalem was considered almost impregnable in the time of David. It was ruled by the Jebusites. We'll read about them in his story. They occupied a hilltop that now is just to the south end of the modern day old city. Well, that hilltop is almost under the Temple Mount that's on top of it now. And the Temple Mount isn't all that big. Like, our conception of space is completely different than theirs. They didn't build things the size of modern football stadiums. They didn't build things the size of Holy Spirit Church. Like in ancient Israel, this would have been bigger than the king's palace by far. Like dramatically larger than a king's palace. Cities come with additional problems to solve, especially of sanitation. They don't have indoor plumbing, so you have to figure out what to do with waste. They smelled. They were often disease-ridden. You were far better off being in the countryside where you had the ability to grow food. They had a greater need for defense. In the countryside, you were more exposed. to attacks, but you also you had that closer contact with food. For their diet, bread is the major component. Grain ground by hand, quite often in large mills. Sometimes they would use animals. That seems to be using animals for grain production seems to have come about later. Or using animals in like grinding grain and flour, like the giant millstones in the time of Jesus. That seems to be a bit later than Iron Age Israel. In this case, they would have a large stone that was round. It would go in a groove, and they would run it back and forth over grain to make flour. Like I mentioned before, grinding grain produced a bunch of sand and rocks, which gradually wore down their teeth. They also don't have toothbrushes, sadly, and didn't know about things like plaque and dental hygiene. Very different. Bread seemed to have been baked quite often in clay ovens. They would build a clay oven that surrounded a fire. And that was where they baked their bread. It's possible in a lot of the ancient societies, and some of them still do this today, they actually bake the bread by sticking it to the walls of their oven. So you can see, I forget what culture it is, but one of them, if it's Georgia or Azerbaijan, but they have a traditional bread that's made. They have these giant ovens with a big hole in the top, and they have people that like grab the loaf of bread and dive into the oven and stick it to the wall and then like fling themselves out again. And it's quite a process to watch. And it's this famous bread that they produce in the loaves, like in thousands of loaves. These ovens probably weren't that big. You aren't talking about large-scale industrial production for the most part, but they baked bread. That was one of the major components of their diet. They used both leavened and unleavened bread. Unleavened bread was much faster to make. You didn't have to let it rise. Leavened bread was a sourdough. It used natural yeast. You had a starter. You baked from that starter, and you saved part of it for the next day or the next several days. They could also get yeast from brewing beer. Beer was an important thing. The ancient Egyptians had it because beer preserves the nutritional value of grain in a form that's shelf stable, especially as the alcohol content increases. Because remember, this is also a society and a world where there's no refrigeration. So not only is food production hard and time consuming, but there's no real way to save it very long. And it would constantly be going bad, and you'd have to deal with mold and drying out and all sorts of things. Bread was usually made with flour, water, and salt. Unleavened bread didn't last as long as leavened bread. The process of allowing it to rise makes it more stable and less subject to decay as quickly. They used many different grains to make it. It's not just wheat, but wheat became the preferred one. Barley doesn't rise as well as wheat does, so barley loaves, like one of the stories of the loaves and the fish, talks about a young boy with barley loaves. Barley loaves, there isn't enough, I forget if it's protein in the structure of the bread to maintain a rise, so they deflate after you cook them. They're not as good. Grain was also used to make porridge, which is a kind of cooked grain mash. Oatmeal would be one of the few remaining modern forms of porridge, but porridge was common food for much of human history. You would mix grain with several other things and cook it for some time. It was also used to make beer. They had a variety of fruits and vegetables. Dates, pomegranates, and figs are all important. Dates grow on a kind of palm tree, date palms. Figs are a relatively hardy tree. They can survive in the land of Israel. Olives are probably the most important oil crop. Olives were used to make oil. That was a big deal for the temple. They have legumes like the beans. Dry beans are a legume. Onions, leeks, lentils. For seasonings, this was another thing we forget in the modern world. We have such variety of spices. For most of human history, there was a spice trade. Spices were rare, they were exotic. Bland food was the norm. So it took a long time for us to begin to cultivate the plants that we would use to spice things. But they had a few: salt, garlic, anise, coriander, cumin, dill, thyme, mint, nuts, and honey. For vegetables, they had carrots and cucumbers, onions, garlic, field greens, lettuces, those kinds of things. Corn, squash, those all come from the United States and North America. Potatoes are from South America. Lots of the vegetables that we have today, they didn't have, sadly. Chickpeas, peas, and lentils were the often legume kind of things. They stored grains between harvests, often in clay or stone jars. Probably clay is more likely because it's lighter weight than stone, and it was easier to make. You could shape clay. Poor harvests were common, so they were always trying to find ways to store food, and they were fighting against their climate because they don't have a lot of shelf-stable things. And without winter, you don't have to provide for heat, which is good, but food preservation is a lot harder. This was an area that even thousands of years ago experienced frequent major large-scale droughts. The climate was changing. It would shift from wet to dry. That part wasn't easy. They frequently fermented or dried things as a way to preserve them. So raisins from grapes, dates, and figs, they all dry well. Vegetables, meats would be dried and smoked sometimes into what we would call now like jerky. That was a way to preserve meat. Meat was rarely eaten by most people, only for ceremonial meals or the most important celebrations. Part of that is because animals were too valuable as a source of products. You didn't want to kill the cow because the cow gave you milk. And milk you could use to make cheese. And if you kill the cow, you don't have any more milk. Sheep were the same. Sheep, you can use sheep's milk, you can drink it, you can make cheese out of it. Sheep also provide wool, which it was a major source of fiber for clothing. So you didn't want to kill your sheep very often either, which gives a new context and a new meaning to the sacrifice of a sheep for Passover. Because you're sacrificing an important part of your food production, an important part of your livelihood, to eat at a single meal. That was rare for most people. People often made stews from legumes, nuts, and vegetables and grain. They would mix it all together in a pot over the fire, and that was common food. They used a form of cooking called tanur cooking, which means you have an oven shaped like a beehive. It's an ancient thing. They had stuff like when you put the lid on it and when you don't put the lid on it, and usually the opening was the size of a pot, and you would put the pot on top of the opening, and that's how you would cook. The morning meal, if you had one at all, was often porridge. It was made more quickly. They ground large pieces of grain together. That would be like modern day oatmeal. Clothing is often woven at home. In Israel, it came from sheep's hair, so wool, and from goats, and from flax. This required spinning wool into thread. This was an important part of the life of women. Like a large part of the time of women was involved in making clothing for their whole family, for society. That was a time of socialization. The women would get together and they would sew clothes. They would spin wool into thread, then they would use the thread to weave clothing. It's a very, very time-consuming process. And so that was an important part of their social lives. You'd get together and you'd have clothing making day, sort of. Clothing in Jewish societies was long and modest. It frequently covered most of the body, which is part of modesty, but it's also because you're constantly trying to save yourself from the sun. The sun is your enemy. People would probably have dark bronze skin in large part because they were exposed to the sun so often. So you can think of like the modern challenge with skin cancer and how careful we are about skin stuff. In the ancient world, that was probably extremely common because, again, there's no knowledge of it, there's no way to treat it. Animals, caring for them also took large amounts of time. Sheep and goats were the principal herd animals. They don't eat as much as cows and horses do. Those wealthier people would have. They're also more resilient in drought than cattle. They're less sensitive to interruptions in food supply. Sheep provide wool, cows and goats and sheep provide milk. Chickens seem to come later in the Iron Age, but eventually the Israelites keep chickens. Seafood was not as common in ancient Israel. Fish were somewhat, but there aren't a lot of rivers. So unless you lived along the Mediterranean, which they didn't like because they're not good seafarers, and that's where the Philistines and the Phoenicians live, or along the Sea of Galilee, if you lived near the Sea of Galilee, fishing was much more common. But if you were in the hill country in Judea, not as much. When they butchered, they used everything. They saved bones, they saved ligaments. Stomachs were dried out and used for storing liquids. They had ways of using almost everything that came from the animal. Skins were also saved for cloth. They would be tanned and made into various garments. Leather is an important thing. Meat was often shared between families because it had to be used quickly. You didn't have a way to save it. So if you killed the sheep, you had to eat the sheep. You could probably save it for a day in the open air, but you would very quickly run into the problem of maggots. It's a tough world that they lived in. This is part of the reason why you start to see how different our standard of living is today. Harvest was an important time in the life of the people, in the life of the whole village. They came together. It was a celebration. It was one of the few times of the year where there was likely more abundance. So it was a ton of work, but you had enough to eat for at least a while. Bad harvests were common. Climate was unstable. Other jobs or occupations that people had. Stone workers, that was the major building material of the era. It's found everywhere. You always have to work with stones. Merchants, they didn't seem to have a lot of merchants. You need a more developed economy for people not to be involved in food production. Especially at this time, there wasn't likely a lot of that. Religious occupations, priesthood, Levitical service, those were either tied to genealogy, but also tied to learning to read, which was relatively uncommon. And again, when you have a society that's a subsistence society, when most people are involved in food production and it's a constant struggle to survive, you don't have the luxury of learning. Life is occupied in work from sun up to sundown all day, more or less every day. Hunting was not as common in ancient Israel, hunting wild game, because it's not a stable source of food unless you have large areas of protected land, and most of the land is owned by a few people, so they would have more hunting, but otherwise they didn't do as much of that. Brewing, being a brewer, was a more common occupation. Brewed ale was more stable than water. It didn't go bad as easily. Oh, I should have added people that grew grapes and made wine. Wine is another way of preserving the nutritional character of grapes because as the alcohol content increases, it is much more resistant to mold. In a hot culture, they suffer from evaporation, so wine was always mixed with water to drink because wine would become more and more concentrated over time as it got older. but making wine was an important part in Israel. A tanner, they used animal skins. It was a smelly process, so they often had to live outside of town. We encountered that in the story of Peter and Cornelius. The tanner was outside the walls of the town. They made leather and animal skins into various kinds of wares and some clothing. Probably used it to create some bags to travel. Somewhat related to leather working as it comes about in the Middle Ages. Blacksmiths were important people in society as well. They worked with metal, they made tools, they made weapons. Potters were probably one of the most important part. I've always secretly wanted to learn how to make pots. I think it would be fun. But clay was extremely important for life. They were always using it. It's a kind of mud that when you dry it out and bake it becomes hard like stone, and it holds liquids. They dried them in a kiln. Fishermen, boats and nets, they often fished at night because the day was so hot and fish like to eat at night. Basket makers, they would weave things. This was probably done more so by women in the home. You would weave your own baskets from reeds and different sorts of things. But there were some of them. Shepherds cared for sheep. That was not a well thought of occupation. Miners. This is one of the extremely hard ones. You often didn't survive mining, so they often used it for political prisoners and slaves. The death rate, the average death rate, I think, was a couple years that you'd survive on average due to collapses in mining areas, due to injuries, breathing dust and all sorts of problems that you run into. But ore was an important part of coin making and iron making and lots of other things. They would have had guilds, groups of tradesmen and craftsmen that were organized into a kind of society, maybe not quite as vicious as the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, you had to be part of the guild or you didn't exist and couldn't sell your wares. It's probably not quite like that. They used a lot of simple musical instruments. Music was an easy form of entertainment. It was cheap. Bone flutes were probably the most common. They were easy to make, but they had several other kinds of things, lyres and different things. A lyre is like an ancient guitar sort of thing, strings stretched across something that you used to play them. They had a lot of simple games. Storytelling was a big deal in societal life. Storytelling was a way of preserving knowledge and preserving wisdom. It was also a way of entertainment in long nights. They easily spent time with people because they lived in smaller groups. They don't have as much disconnection from each other. You need other people. Celebrations of life, death and birth and weddings were a major part of life. Weddings by the time of Jesus were known to go on for days. There was lots of joy and food.